We actually probably have this part out before we get that part out. All right, I know we did. Let's start. I guess we won't start there. All right, for you guys in here and for you guys online, if there's an issue with seeing something like there is now because I didn't turn the overhead projector on, you have to let me know. Now, I may not know it at that moment. I can get my work emails on my phone, but I can't focus on two things at one time. Because that's what I tried to do last time is, y'all email me if something goes wrong. And then I would talk and I would never look down to see if there were emails coming in on my phone. So I'll see it when I get to work, but I won't see it while we're here. But at least tell me the next, email me knowing that I'll see it later. Tell me the next class period. But at some point, let me know that things aren't working and we need to fix something. Okay, so that is not where we stopped. We got through that. We got through that. We got through the Armada. I think this is where this sounds like where we stopped. And I got farther with you guys than I did with the other class. So, I'm very thirsty. Let's just kind of recap a little bit. Great Britain includes England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, the whole little island nation. It's not a little island nation, it's a fairly big island nation. After, I'm going to suggest a video for y'all. Well, I'm not going to suggest it. I'm going to tell you to watch a video. I haven't put it on Blackboard yet, but I will. And in the video, it's going to say that James I united Great Britain. I really think Elizabeth united Great Britain. So you can go with either one. She's the one who set James up to become king. And by setting him up to become king, she gets the Scots to come in. They're safe frontiers after that point because now Scotland and England aren't fighting. The Irish are always going to fight, but that's a whole different thing. Pretty much towards the end of her reign, she had England in control. It may not have been legally on paper yet, but she had everything lined out so that it would be. The British rulers shared their power with the aristocracy and with the gentry through Parliament, House of Lords, House of Commons. We've talked about how the feudal system had declined, and really the only true nobles left were the ones that were in the House of Lords. But very importantly, English practice self-rule. Their legal system just sort of developed. And a lot of things, everybody in the hall is being listening to my lecture. Not that there's one person out there. The English took a lot of I'm going to say liberties, but that's really not the proper term. They did a lot of things out of habit. They expanded on documents like the Magna Carta, sorry, in 1215 was signed to ensure that monarchs could not violate the laws of the lords and the aristocracy. But over time, by the 1600s, that has expanded. No one's changed the document, but it has expanded to include commoners, to include the gentry, that there were rights the king can't violate. Because it is kind of this, we're from Texas. It's hard to say it's a big country, but in European standards, it's a pretty big country. They're kind of spread out. People, the little villages ruled themselves. They set up their own, but within limits, they set up their own systems. Taxes had to be by consent of Parliament. This is again one of those spoken but unspoken, and James is going to try to change it. It's going to go badly for him. And common law. Common law has become the law of the land. It was originally to check the arbitrary power of the local lords under a feudal system. Because you can imagine if you pretty much own the people on your land, it's pretty easy to start abusing them. So common law was developed to kind of help that. You couldn't have unlawful search and seizure under common law. You had to have a warrant. If you were accused of something, you had to have a trial by jury. These things kind of sound familiar because we're going to inherit them as we go forward. Also, at this time, we started talking about primogeniture during this class, didn't we? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. So you also have some other issues going on at this time. Because the feudal system is failing, or not failing, but just kind of fading out, landowners are kind of at not a quandary, but they have an opportunity. They can do other things with their land. And one of the things they do is kick the peasants off and bring sheep in. Sheep don't complain. Sheep bring you money. It was called the enclosure system or the enclosure movement. So the peasants are starting to be pushed out. They're starting to go to places like London, the bigger cities. They are not causing problems, but they are causing problems. Homelessness, what we would class it as homelessness now. Vagrancy, all of that is on the rise. This is also driven in part by that biological exchange between the Spanish explorers in the New World. They bring back corn. They bring back all these wonderful things you can eat that will grow everywhere, like potatoes. And there's a population explosion. Better agriculture means more food, means more people eat, means more people survive. So now you have a population explosion in a place where the landowners don't want the land to be used by people. So the people have to go somewhere. So the cities are getting overcrowded. When cities get overcrowded, sanitation suffers, lawlessness suffers. And then there's another problem. England isn't all that big. And the landowners who own land, say you own 250 acres. That's not a huge amount if you're a Texas rancher. But in England, that's a pretty fair amount. But you have 5 sons, and you're on your deathbed. What happens to your land? You don't split it up 5 ways. Most people today, that would be, we'll just split, or we'll sell it and split the money. No, land was important. You hang on to it and you keep it together. So the oldest son, it's a system called primogeniture. The oldest son inherits all. They get the family home, they get the land, they get it all. Sons 2, 3, 4, and 5 have to figure something else out. Usually son number 2 went into the priesthood, son number 3 would go into the military, and sons number 4 and number 5 were supposed to become enterprising. They were supposed to figure something out to make their way in the world. Now we're talking basically rich boys who are now on their own. You've been raised with money. Perhaps they've gotten an education, perhaps they've not. But now they have to go out and make their own way. This can work either one way or the other. You can be very inspired and become very entrepreneurial, or not. And a lot of them did. But there had to be a place for them to do that. And this new world was one of those places. A lot of those younger sons went into business in joint stock companies, which for all you business people, that's the forerunner of corporations, where instead of the king funding a ship to go across the ocean and settle a colony, you have a bunch of investors that get together and fund the ship to send it across the ocean. Most of them were hoping to either find that fabled passage to Asia or gold. Unfortunately for the English, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, in the long run it works out. Well, not exactly for the British, but it works out for us. They don't land where there's gold. They land where there's Indians and disease and swamps, but a lot of fertile land. So you have kind of the perfect storm for, let's start looking at what the Spanish were doing. Let's start going to this new world. Let's start exploring. You have extra working people that people want to get out of London. You have rich people who can afford to make a joint stock company, if for no other reason than to get their sons a job so they can go somewhere else. And that's what happens. English colonization starts. And it starts with Elizabeth. Elizabeth is still queen. When Sir Humphrey Gilbert comes to her wanting to start a colony in the New World in the name of England, she gives him, in 1578, a royal patent to, quote, possess heathen and barbarous lands, countries, and territories not actually possessed by any Christian prince or people. So basically, don't go where the Spanish are. They've already claimed it. Anything else is fair game. Unless for some unknown reason, those people are Christian, and then you can't kick them out. Anybody else, it doesn't matter. You can claim the lands. This patent included a clause that any new settlement would ensure the, quote, rights and privileges of Englishmen, unquote. This is going to be important later. But the idea was they were just going to transplant the English village from one side of the ocean to the other. You would still be represented by Parliament. You would still have common law. You would still be able to be an Englishman. They set out in 1583. They're aiming for what we would now call Narragansett Bay. They land in Newfoundland. Newfoundland's cold. They don't actually set up a settlement. They do a little exploring. And then they disappear on the way home. All sign of them is lost. But the English don't give up. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh went back to, well, probably before 84, but he starts out in 84. Raleigh gets permission from Elizabeth to take up Gilbert's cause. Same parameters, rights of Englishmen, all of that stuff. And he leads an expedition to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Of course, it wasn't the Outer Banks of North Carolina at the time, but that's where they go. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh doesn't go with them. He sends the ships. In 1587, he sends more ships out with a man named John White, who's going to be the governor of the new colony, and 100 settlers, and they plan to set up a colony on Roanoke Island. Roanoke Island is a little island off the North Carolina coast. They get there, they start setting things up. The first English child is born in the New World. Her name was Virginia Dare. It was White's granddaughter. They're running low on supplies, and White leaves after a month. So he sails back to England to get supplies, gets to England, and he's held up because we have to fight the Spanish Armada. You got to remember, travel times are different then than they are now. You know, we're talking, it takes a couple of 2 to 3 months to sail across the ocean. Then you have to gather everything you need. Then you have to get it loaded back on a ship and go home. It can take up to a year just to make a grocery run, basically. You know, if any of y'all ever live out of town, you kind of know this concept on a shorter timeline. I live 30 minutes out of town, so any trip to town is going to take over an hour. You find out you don't need a lot of things when you realize you're going to have to give up an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours of your time just to go get a bottle of ketchup. You know, no, I just really don't need it that bad. But you have to have supplies if you're at some point. So White goes back. He's held up. He doesn't get back for 3 years. When he gets back in 1590, he finds no one there. There are some cryptic messages. We're not going to go into the details about Roanoke Island. I will put some extra credit. There's an article and a little test if you want to get some extra credit. I'll put on Blackboard. But it's really kind of fascinating. You know, they when he leaves, they have a system. You know, they have a plan. If something goes wrong, you're going to go here. You're going to leave these code words behind. Part of the code word is left behind. So for all of y'all Supernatural fans, Croatoan was the word that they were supposed to carve on a post or something. But they go back and there's nobody. So when Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603 and King James VI becomes King James I, there's no English presence in the New World, but it's going to change pretty quick. In 1606, James I gives a charter to the Virginia Company, and they have two groups. They have a London group and a Plymouth group. They're going to start out, let's see, let's flip the slide. They're going to start out on May 6, 1607, 3 ships and 105 men. They land at Chesapeake Bay. They follow the James River upstream, around a curve. They think that's going to hide them from the Spanish, which probably did help. So they end up about 40 miles inland, and they establish a colony at Jamestown. Jamestown is going to be the first real colony that's going to last a while. It was rough, and these colonies will kind of follow a pattern. They start out really rough because it's basically, at this point, you're camping. You know, you're not coming into an area that's been cleared necessarily, that has definitely not that has homes. You're kind of on your own. So they set about building a fort, some thatched huts, a storehouse, a church. You got to have a church. Church is important. And they start trying to farm. Problem is, these guys aren't farmers. They're either the rich sons or the bums that they've gotten out of the city. Okay, that's probably not the right term. Bums is probably very derogatory. Working people that they've gotten out of the city, but they don't necessarily have farmers with them. What they do have is a man named John Smith, who was a great leader, probably not the most well-liked man in the world, but he could organize. And they had some help from the Indians. The Indians that they met were part of the Powhatan Confederacy, which was a confederacy of about 30 Algonquian tribes. At first, Powhatan, who was the chief, didn't see a threat from these English settlers. Powhatan had actually made himself a pretty lucrative little kingdom. These 30 tribes that were in his confederacy were paying him tribute of about 80% of all the corn they raised. You know, he was living high on the hog. And not that he was necessarily bad to the people he ruled. He kept peace in the area, but he was a businessman in Indian terms, and he saw these new people as another trade source. It didn't dawn on him until it was a little too late that they didn't plan on ever going away, and that there were more coming. So the Indians helped them. They helped them by giving them food to survive. They helped them learn how to plant. And yes, Pocahontas was Powhatan's daughter, but she doesn't have a romance with John Smith. She actually marries somebody else. She does save his life, but and not once, but several times, but not out of any affectionate, loving affection. That's a Disney thing. But to survive, Smith had to impose strict rules. Everybody works. You don't work, you don't eat. And he meant it. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And still, only 38 of the 105 that came over are going to survive the first 9 months. It was a rough time. And then it's going to get a little rougher. in 1609. So they're hanging in there. There's not very many of them, but they're hanging in there. 1609. Well, there's Smith gets injured. There's a explosion of gunpowder. He gets burned. He sails back to England. They send over more colonists, including some women, because women didn't come. It was 105 men. It came the first time. There's a few women in the second group. But the winter of 1609 to 1610 was really hard. They called it the starving time. And even though they had brought over a couple of hundred more people, there were only 60 left alive in 1610 when relief came. The starving time was really bad. I didn't put names in my notes, but people were eating pretty much anything: rats, cats, dogs, the leather off their shoes. One man will be stoned to death because he kills his pregnant wife and feasts on her body. You're starving, but even that's not acceptable. So he didn't survive that. It's really bad. But there is relief in sight. One, they do keep sending more colonists over, more ships, because there's lots of people that you want to get out of London, and there's people who want to make money. So there's more people coming, and they figure out tobacco. John Rolfe is one of the colonists. He's a widower. He kind of steps up, doesn't actually take John Smith's role, but he becomes a leader in the colony, and the Indians introduce him to tobacco. Now, or locally grown tobacco. Now, tobacco is one of the things that the Spanish brought back from South America that caught on in Europe really, really quick. King James doesn't like tobacco. He finds it, smelly, and even in 1612, they knew it wasn't good for you. But people were buying it, and it was bringing in money. And when the Indians showed Rolfe that it could be grown in Virginia, light bulbs started coming on. So he got some better varieties, some Spanish varieties, brought the seeds over, and they start planting tobacco. Tobacco becomes the savior of the colony. It's very, very profitable. They're also, at this time, starting to send over indentured servants. And Rolfe is the one that Pocahontas marries. The settlers kidnap Pocahontas, hoping to ransom her, but she decides she likes them, and she stays with them. She marries Rolfe. They go back to England, and she dies in like 3 months after she gets to England. She gets an upper respiratory something, and ends up dying. But she becomes kind of a celebrity for a while, the Indian princess. But things are starting to turn around. It's not coming real fast, but they're starting to turn around. And in 1618, the Virginia Company, because this is a corporation. This isn't just some English colony or English village that's grown up. This is actually a business, and they control it. The Virginia Company puts out some new rules. They offer a head right. 50 acres to anyone who could get themselves across the ocean, and an additional 50 acres if you bring servants with you. 50 acres for every servant. So if you could round up, a couple of servants, you could have 150 acres. Now it's going to be hard for 3 people to work 150 acres, but you got it. They also, in 1619, set up an assembly system. On July 30th, 1690, the first General Assembly of Virginia met in Jamestown Church for 5 days. I don't know if any of you have ever been in Virginia in July, but it's hot and it's humid, and they didn't have air conditioning. So I'm sure those 5 days in that Virginia church were rough. But they now have a legislative body. They have representation. Doesn't go directly to Parliament, but they have some, they're starting to practice that self-rule and common law that is habitual in the rest of England. That same year, they send more women. 90 women come to the colonies, basically for sale. 125 pounds of tobacco, but the woman had to agree to who was buying her. So you had some mail order brides. Also the first time you get African Americans, or African, they're not African Americans at this point, they're just Africans. This is when the first Africans come to the to the North American colonies. The Spanish have been Spanish and the Dutch have been trading them for over 100 years now, but they need workers, and they bring in 20 African slaves. Now, these first slaves were probably treated more as indentured servants than as what we picture as Southern slavery. It was a kind of a different system. And slavery has existed in the world at this point from time immemorial. You'll find references to it in a lot of really old texts like the Bible. But the first ones that came over, it wasn't codified necessarily by color. And they were treated, like I said, in a lot of ways, more like indentured servants. Do y'all know what an indentured servant is? I've used that phrase like 4 times now and haven't explained it. Does anybody need me to explain it?
Yes.
Okay. An indentured servant is somebody who basically sells themselves into slavery. You sign a contract. So I'm a landless person in London. I have no chance of employment. I want to go to the New World. You're a landowner. You're going to the New World. I'll work for you for 7 years, whatever you need. At the end of 7 years, you have to pay me $500. You have to buy me 10 acres and set me up with a plow. So it's a contract employee, basically. Does that make sense? That's what these indentured servants were. And the time frames, it was negotiable. 7 years was usually what they signed up for. And a lot of people come to the Americas as indentured servants. You also had to provide my passage. That was the big thing. You have to provide my passage across the ocean, because now I belong to you, and that if you want me to work, you got to get me over there. So you have a large class of these people who are, I'm still free. I'm still a free person, but I'm not. Because I signed that contract, I can't go anywhere. And if I run away, you can have me hunted down and brought back. You can punish me. It was okay to beat your indentured servants. There was nothing illegal about that. But a lot of people come that way. And these first African Americans were probably treated more like indentured servants than they were actually slaves. And some of them will end up with their freedom. Honestly, most are going to die, but most everybody that came to your odds of survival are not great, but by 1620s, it's getting better. The profitable tobacco crops increase the need for land. I don't know if any of you have ever had to clear land by hand, but it's an arduous process. And Virginia has trees. You know, we have bushes. We don't have trees. But, well, we have mesquite. But it's hard to clear land. But the Algonquian Indians farmed. They have land that's already cleared. So what do the English do? They start taking in Indian lands. The tensions start rising. And by 1622, the Indians had figured out that these English weren't just good trading partners, they were a blight on society, and they needed to be gone. They rebel. They kill about a fourth of the settlers, which at this point has gotten to be a pretty big group. 350 people were killed. That was a fourth of the population, including John Rolfe. He gets killed in that. The uprising is put down with prejudice. I mean, it is put down with such force that at least in that location, it never reoccurs. Through violence, through disease, the 24,000 Algonquins that lived in the Chesapeake area when the English settlers get there around 1607, by 1669 is reduced down to 2,000 people, which is another reason you have to bring in slaves, because they were enslaving the Indians. The Indians enslaved the Indians. Slavery is just a weird, it's an unsavory thing to have to think about, but it happened. By 1624, the colony is doing well enough that the company is dissolved and the colony becomes a royal colony. So now it is just another English town. It's not a corporation anymore. And they have this assembly that they have already established that's going to represent them to a point. I have run out of slides. Have I run out of slides on here? No, I've run out of slides that I printed. Okay, I'll just have to look at the screen. So, the next colony, okay, so this is Chesapeake Bay. Right through here. And Jamestown is somewhere up in this area. Another colony is started. And we didn't talk about this, but Virginia is named Virginia for the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. Jamestown obviously is named after King James. Maryland is named for Queen Mary. It's founded in 1634. It's also on the Chesapeake Bay, but it's north of the Virginia area. It's a proprietary colony. So we're going to learn about all these different kinds of colonies as we go through. A proprietary colony is a colony that's owned by a single person. And this one is owned by Sir George Calvert, who is Lord Baltimore, which is where we're going to get Baltimore, Maryland. In 1625, so we're backtracking a little bit, Sir Calvert had publicly converted to Catholicism. Not a real popular move in England. And he was petitioning for a colony where English Catholics could go to escape persecution and discrimination. The charter is actually granted in 1632. It is after his death, but his son, who is also the Lord Baltimore, at this point. He's the first son. He inherits, follows his father's wishes, and sets up a colony at St. Mary's on a small stream near the mouth of the Potomac River. That map is not clear enough for me to point out what that is. So, the majority of the people who come to this colony are landowners, wealthy landowners. Most of them were Catholic. Most of the servants and indentured servants were Protestant. So you've got a mix. But the leaders are Catholic, and it's going to be a Catholic colony. Under the charter, Calvert had the power to make laws with the consent of the landowners. They called them freemen. The first legislative assembly met in 1635. So they get started pretty quick, setting up a governmental system. They divide into two houses in 1650. Before that, they're run by a governor and a council. The charter also allows for Calvert to grant huge estates, which he does. He grants 60 before 1676. But they figure out really quick, large estates are great, but they're not. It's better to have a whole bunch of small farmers where you can put settlers on them and get stuff growing really quick. Because if you set a big plantation, then you have to have workers. You don't get things moving as quickly. And most, just like in Virginia, are going to grow tobacco. And tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. You have to do a lot to grow tobacco. And there's steps that even today, when you're growing tobacco, have to be done by hand. You can't really mechanize it. And back then, everything was done by hand. So you have to have a lot of workers. So we've established the two main southern colonies. Southern colonies have a lot going for them. They also have some problems. They're very fertile. Where they landed, the land was very fertile. It's also hot and humid, so there's a lot of disease. But they're doing pretty good. The next colonies are going to be farther north. So, like way farther north. The south is down here. And it's an accident. They don't land there on purpose. The first group that come in were actually headed for Virginia, and you get way off course. But let's talk in general about these New England colonies. And so the colonies that we're talking about are going to be Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Plymouth. So kind of that area, north of New York. You're going to get a different settlement pattern in these New England colonies. You get more middle-class families, people who had enough money to pay their own way, but not really enough to buy like a huge estate. In the South, you really had two classes of people. You had the rich and you had the poor. You had the landowners and you had the indentured servants. And there weren't a lot of people in the middle. New England is going to attract those people in the middle. So there's less indentured servants. There's no planter class. You get more working class merchant type. So you'll have small farmers, fishermen, sailors, merchants. And because they're coming as families, you have more women coming. When you add women to the settlement issue, it changes the dynamics. how many of you guys like played football and hung out in the locker room? Okay, a few of y'all. I'm assuming, because I have a son and I have a husband, that y'all can get pretty raunchy and vulgar and just crude. Have you ever had a female coach walk in? Never?
No.
Never. Dang. That blows my whole description.
Female track.
But you change your language when they come in, don't you? You know, the potty humor kind of goes out. Maybe not completely, but it tones down. My example is usually with firemen. My husband's a fireman. And, you know, I've stood outside the door and listened to them for a minute before I walked in. And when you walk in, a wife, a daughter, everything changes. Because, you know, I'm sorry, they're grown men, but they're little boys still. And it's still the same crude, not ugly, not anything horrible, just they're boys being boys. The same thing happens when you do settlements. When you have women, you have kind of a civilizing effect. And girls can be just as bad. You'll say things with other girls around that you would never say with a guy in the room or with your dad when your dad comes in. So it's not just, but when you have a group of just men, it tends to be a little rougher. And that was the situation in the South, at least in the beginning. It was a very male-centric society. This new colonies up in the North are going to be more family-centric from the very beginning. And we're running out of time, so I will quit babbling. We will finish talking about them next time. Y'all have a great weekend. And remember, well, y'all's group wouldn't come on Monday anyway, but no class on Monday is Labor Day.